Now, let's turn to Andrea, who is going to speak about how global networks of policy and research can support evidence implementation. And Andrea Ordóñez is co-founder of Southern Voice, which is a network of over 60 think tanks from Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Asia, leveraging Southern evidence and analysis to promote fair global development debates. She is an economist by training and currently a senior research fellow with the network. She was previously research director at the group of FARO, a think tank in Ecuador. Her main research interests are social policy, public finance, financing for development, and international cooperation. And her aim is to ensure that the new voices and ideas from Global South are heard across regions. And now you have the voice to share your experience and knowledge. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for having me. As you heard, I am not writing systematic reviews or doing randomized controlled trials. I read some of your work, but I don't do the same things. And my objective for today is to bring some reflections from more this practice of the work of think tanks or research centers that I think may help us tackle some of these challenges of how to get that empathy, that political will, that change that David mentioned that we all need to work on. So I'm going to bring you through 3 main points and 3 slides. I want to discuss how do we unpack policy problems, how do we understand better collaborations, and what does this mean for our work in these large initiatives. So I think it's really important when we are trying to understand policy problems that we also use our analytical skills to unpack the context where we work. And I really like this framework that Robert Hope has developed around understanding policy problems, both in terms of the evidence and how much consensus or not there is around the evidence and the problem, and the norms and values around this problem and whether there's agreement or not agreement. So we have in the pink box the structure problems, and we can say these are like the gold standard problems, right? These are the ones that we love because we already agree that there's a problem, we know that we have to do something, and we're ready to move into action. So what I've seen working with a lot of think tanks in the Global South is that this is a perfect scenario where governments are ready to commission research, they're ready to start discussing interventions. It's about finding what are some of the best options. So this is nice, but this is just a fraction of the problems that our societies face. On the other extreme, in the yellow box, we have the unstructured problems, which are, on the other hand, like little monsters that there's no agreement on the values, there's no clarity and consensus around the evidence, and it's very difficult to deal with these problems. But research organizations and think tanks do work around these problems. Many times what they do is generate spaces of dialogue, open up spaces for diverse voices to come together and try to frame a problem. Because at this stage, it's very difficult to even try to find a solution if we haven't identified the problem. And I think this is part of these moving into understanding each other's positions, finding empathy, and so on. And then we have these other 2 types of problems. We have problems where we have agreement on the evidence, but like there's certainty about the evidence, but there is no agreement on the values. And actually, this coincides very much with what we just heard from David and some of the experiences that I've seen of research centers working on these types of problems. There are many about discrimination. So we know that changing social norms is going to be very difficult. And even though we have very substantial, clear evidence of how discrimination affects well-being, it's very difficult to change social norms around this. But then again, there are research organizations that work on this type of topics. And what I think is interesting is that for these types of problems, they try to navigate politics in such a way that they can find second-best solutions. So in many cases, for example, research organizations would like to have some mandatory policy that would change some of these discriminatory practices or so on, but they know that this wouldn't go through, right? So they try to find some second-best alternatives, some voluntary approaches, for example, or things like that. So these are another type of policy problems that we deal with. And then there are the problems where we agree on the norms and values, but there is lack of clarity around the evidence. And a lot of these problems, what end up requiring is for setting up expert groups or commissions that can help people navigate through the evidence. And some of the cases that I've seen in this type of space are when governments need, for example, to negotiate externally with others. So there's agreement in the country about a certain position or a certain thing that they want to do, but there's no clear evidence, for example, what would be the impact of a new trade agreement or a new deal with the IMF or so on. So there is the need for evidence actors to come together to discuss and evaluate that evidence. So my first objective with bringing this forward is to invite us to use these analytical tools into understanding the context. We really need to move from just saying, you know, we face wicked problems, we face difficult circumstances. We can use the same kind of like analytical skills and capacities that we deploy to some other parts of the research problems into understanding the context and working through it. The other thing is that these problems, as you can see, there's a lot of power dynamics that go in here, and who defines the problem, who is engaged in the problem, who owns the problem. I'm sure that you've probably seen these, right? If a ministry owns a problem, then they'll take it forward. Sometimes it's a hot potato that we want someone else to have the problem. So there's a lot of power dynamics that we also need to understand if we try to change policy. So that's my first point. I think it's really important for us to have this lens of understanding better the context where we're working on and the dynamics of different actors working in this space. And of course, that means because there's so many actors involved, we have to understand how we can collaborate. And I think this is essential, particularly now with this, in this new age of partnerships where everything is meant to be a partnership, but that is not always possible, right? And I think we really need to be clear about that. And I like this other really simple framework for trying to think about that, which is trying to understand which are the goals and the preferences or the preferred strategies of different organizations to see if you can collaborate. And this would also be a strong message that I have from practice. Do not try to force a collaboration that doesn't make sense. So if you find that there's an organization with very different goals and very different strategies, that's probably not going to work that well, right? In this model, it would be a confrontational relationship. On the other hand, of course, if you have very similar goals, very similar strategies, that describes a cooperation, and there can be a lot of space for working together. if you share the same final goals but have different strategies, you can find opportunities to complement each other's works. I find this one very interesting, the one where you have similar strategies, but different goals. And this one in this model is called the co-option status. And I think this one's very important because it many times describes unequal relationships, right? Because an organization that has more resources, that has more power, can many times end up co-opting the agenda of an organization with less power and less resources. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So I think that's the other thing that we need to analyze when we are trying to move the agenda of evidence forward, and acknowledge that even though we are in the age of talking a lot about cooperation and collaborations, partnerships, these ones are not always going to happen, and we can be honest about that as well. And so that takes me to some reflections about what does this mean for communities like the ones that are here. And this is more reflections from being an outsider and seeing other types of organizations working in this. So we can see, how they land in your particular experience. But as we have seen, making sure that evidence gets used in policy is a lot of negotiation, it's a lot of trust, it's a lot of relationships. So it does matter who is setting the agenda for the research, who is carrying out the research processes, and who is involved in taking this to the policy debate and the policy spaces. Then I think that the second question that is very important is around incentives, and I think this has been coming out a lot in the plenaries already before, because it's not in a traditional research career incentive to think critically about some of the questions that I've been posing before around what are the types of policy problems that we're tackling, what is the real value of evidence, and maybe sometimes saying it's not evidence what we need in this problem. So the incentives are not there to have this perspective that would tackle policy problems. We're still in a framework where we're trying to push this publish or perish model, and that's probably not going to take us anywhere. And the final is around the sustainability of organizations. So like I mentioned, I work a lot with organizations, research centers and think tanks across the Global South. And many of these organizations are the one carrying out these work of understanding the policy problems or trying to get evidence into the discussions of policymakers. But a lot of these organizations do not have the same sustainability as universities or as other organizations in the Global North. So that is the other critical question about whether these organizations can be sustainable to maintain the actual work of influencing policy that is not going to happen in the cycle of one project or in the cycle of one research paper, right? So when we're thinking about how we want the system to work, we really need to consider all these additional questions. So that is the end of my presentation. Like I said, I had these 3 points that I wanted to share with you: to look at the policy problems, to think critically about how and when we can collaborate, and what does this mean for communities like the ones that are here today, and how can they be more inclusive of different voices and ensure the sustainability of the different organizations that are needed to make sure that evidence gets into practice. Thank you.